Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of the Empowered Living Club's series on perspectives in aging in place. We welcome you, and we're glad you're here, and we hope you learn something from this. This is one in a series. As we said, the series is about aging in place, staying at home longer. And today we're going to be going into some of the compliance issues. All righty. So we sometimes talk about the three C's, the care and the cost and the compliance. And today we're into more of the compliance end of things. Um, as we said, well, we just had a slide that gave a little bit about that series. I think a number of people are familiar with it. For those who aren't, you can go back in and look. There is a disclaimer in terms of this is educational work. This is not advice. Okay, so Empowered Living Club, and I think a number of people are familiar with that, either having been to prior presentations or prior discussions, or having looked at some on the website once these are posted. The majority of people these days appear and consume it on demand. So the Empowered Living Club is a new community resource. We deal with educational issues, we deal with purchasing issues, we deal with some support issues. It's open to anyone 18 or over who is living in the United States generally, and I suppose there's really nothing to stop us from Americans living abroad. And it has to do with facing the challenges and embracing the opportunities of aging. Today we're doing most of the expertise is all of the expertise is essentially in-house. I'm moderating and commenting from time to time. Gail Glockhoff Long, who is part of the team, is an insurance specialist and benefits advocate. She is also very active in the issues of running a business and all of those sorts of types of issues that really will factor into today's discussion. Kathy, of course, Kathy Nitz has been with Golder Care since the very beginning. Kathy's primary focus is on public benefits, getting people onto public benefits. And one of the problems that she sees a lot of is people who have not done it right when they've hired care to come into the home. They have issues that carry over from that, and when mom or whomever, when they or their loved one is finally leaving the home, or even then going on to public benefits there and applying for public benefits, there are some problems as to the way things have been held or have been handled. And then, of course, Ben Beekle is our lawyer. And when we're talking about compliance issues, you pretty much got to have a lawyer involved at some level. And Ben is a specialist in elder law. He took over the practice that I once had back in the days when I was a lawyer. So, and we do share offices with Ben, although we are two totally separate organizations. So, and I see we have a lawyer who has joined us, and that is Hillary Strayer from Iowa City, who is a great expert in her own right. So she might even chirp in on something, who knows, or ask a question. At any rate, we're talking today about hiring in for home care and legal and compliance concerns, okay? So the situation is this. Mom, we're taking care of mom, or I'm at home, whichever it is, whether the loved one is someone else or whether it's yourself. And we've gotten to the point where I need care in order to stay home, okay? And the question then becomes, do we have enough, we call it an HR question, human resources. Is there enough care at home given by family members or neighbors or whomever, people who are taking care of mom, people who are taking care of me? They may not live with mom, but they may be coming in to do it. It could be family members, as I say, it could be neighbors, could be spouses who are family members, obviously. It could be any of those, but we're talking about volunteer services. And when we get to the point where that's not enough, then we look at hiring care. And how do you do that? Well, obviously, sometimes we talk about making placements, giving care in an institutional setting. Well, that's not what we're discussing today. This is a series about aging in place and staying home as long as possible. So we're not talking about institutional care. We're talking about rendering care at home. And the question then becomes how we have to hire care. Do we hire it through an agency? Or do we actually hire caregivers ourselves? And that's really what this is all about, the compliance issues of doing that. And when we do that, there's a question is, are we hiring family members? Sometimes we may be. There are some special considerations that may come into play there. Or are we hiring general members of the public, other people with a certain level of expertise or professionalism in terms of rendering care, et cetera, et cetera. So whether we're hiring insiders or outsiders, we have these compliance issues, and that's what our discussion today is all about. So we're talking about if we're not using an agency, if we're doing it ourselves. This is for do-it-yourselfers or people who are considering that. We're not doing that. What are your responsibilities when you're actually hiring the care for yourself or for mom? Okay, what are they? You can see some indication there that we've already kind of briefly mentioned. And the next slide digs into it just a little bit deeper. Have you ever thought about, and here are some issues that come up: withholding, that's tax withholding, workers' comp insurance, liability insurance, background checks, reporting requirements. Are we a mandated reporter, for instance? Are you a mandated reporter? Written employment contracts, formalities, the arm's length transaction, and normalizing for a marketplace provisions, record keeping, backup plan, et cetera, et cetera. These are just some of the things that can come up. We have maybe 40, 45 minutes here now. So number one, we are probably not going to even touch all of those. And to the extent that we do, we're certainly not going to have the last word or give any particularly extensive explanations, because this is really today far more of a survey. It's intended as an initial presentation or an initial educational session, just to get people sensitized to some of these issues that they might not think about. The thought is, oh, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to hire somebody to do this, or we'll hire the grandchild is available and we'll pay them to do it. A lot of times, all of the nitty gritty hasn't even been thought of. We don't know about until we kind of get into these things. So with that said, I think this is the time when Gail and Ben take over as the primary discussing people, and Kathy and I will chirp in as necessary.
The question starts with, are they an employee or an independent contractor? And Ben and I are going to give you two different perspectives. He will give you the attorney perspective, and I will give you the answer that the accountant gave me. So, Ben?
Well, from a purely, I guess, risk-based perspective or an accountant's perspective, as far as well, let's start with this. The distinction between an employee and an independent contractor is really a distinction of who is ultimately responsible for the taxes on the income that you're paying out to the home health care worker or whoever you've got assisting you. If your independent home healthcare provider is, if they are an independent contractor, you pay them money in exchange for the services, but you are not required to withhold taxes like FICA taxes, self-employment, things like that. your responsibilities essentially end when you give them their biweekly or monthly paycheck. And at the end of the year, you also have to make sure you're giving them a record, a 1099 form of exactly how much you pay out each year. An employee, on the other hand, is someone for whom you as the employer would have to actually withhold, FICA taxes, workers' compensation pieces, unemployment, things like that. The IRS, and most state level agencies, when figuring out whether a given employment relationship is an employee relationship or an independent contractor relationship, are going to look principally at the level of control you have over that person. So do they work a specific number of hours each day? Are they exclusively to provide care for you? Are they able to provide care for others while still maintaining the employment relationship with you? Are they who is in control of the amounts that they pay to you that gets paid as a wage? On and on and so forth. But the point is, the more control that you, the employer or the person who's being provided care, exert over that individual, the more likely the IRS, if it comes to push or shove, will say, okay, that person's an employee. That's going to trigger responsibilities on you, employer slash care providee, I guess you'd say, to do these withholdings and make sure you're essentially paying the IRS their taxes on their behalf.
And from the accountant's point of view, the accountant I spoke with has actually done this for several clients, and in some cases, it's for a nanny, which is basically the same scenario as having someone come in and care for your older loved one. And in the cases that he has dealt with the IRS has almost always gone with, these people are employees if you're setting their work hours and prescribing their duties. So in either case, you're going to want to have a contract, which we'll be talking about later, which defines exactly who is doing what's the schedule, that you're anticipating, and the contract will define, is this person an employee or an independent contractor, so that it's very clear as to who is paying the taxes. If you're thinking, well, I'll just have somebody come over, like you had, a babysitter when your kids were young, and the teenager came over, and you paid them $20 in cash and you were good. That's not going to work in this scenario. And we're going to point out several different reasons why you do not want to do it that way. And one of which is being able to use to offset taxes. But the bottom line, if you're not clear if this person you're hiring is going to be an employee or an independent contractor, you need to go see your accountant and plan it all out, because of all the things that are involved in either side, but much more involved if they're an employee, all the reporting and the withholding and the tax setup that we're going to get to in a couple of slides. So if they are an independent contractor, then you are going to have tax forms at the end of the year. They're going to be doing their own taxes, but you're going to have a report that says the person at this Social Security number, I paid them more than $600 a year, so I'm going to be turning in a tax form to them announcing that, saying we've paid you X amount. And I'm also going to be sending something to in my taxes. It's going to say, I want a deduction for this much in healthcare expenses, and it went to this person. If they're an employee, you're going to have an actual W-2 form that you will be sending to them. Okay, they are a W-2 employee. Let's put them in that category. The first thing you're going to want to do is, before you hire them, you obviously are going to interview them, and then you're going to want to do a background check. You want to make sure that, what we always tease in our office, they're not a mass murderer, but in all seriousness, you're going to want to do a background check to make sure they do not have any reports of adult abuse or child abuse, because they kind of go together. You want to make sure that they have not abused another person for some reason. You want to go through the Patriot Act is the verification that they are who they say they are. They have not stolen somebody's identity. So you have to have 3 different forms of identification. I have to have that on all employees here at the office. They give me some form of identification, and that they are here under, if they're not an American citizen, what status are they for employment purposes. If they are a W-2 employee, then you need to file with the state that you are now a household employer, and you file with the state unemployment office. You then get a number for your business number. And that's what you use on the tax forms that you have to file quarterly, and sending in your reports and sending in your payments to the state and also federally, because you'll be doing the withholdings, and you use that tax ID number of your household employer ID number to send in those reports and tax amounts. You have to be a very good record keeper. I can tell you in the process, because I've been through this, not as a home person, but I do the HR for our office. I do the tax entity for our office, working with our accountants. And when we established Ben's business, and when Golder Care established its own entity, I had to file with the state for those ID numbers and fill out all the forms. And then we have to submit, Golder Care as an employer submits those forms quarterly and makes the payments quarterly. And all of that would be done by you for both the unemployment and the FICA, Social Security, all of those tax payments.
I'm going to jump in just a real quick minute and sort of review. We're talking about if you're going to hire somebody that is not with an agency. If, we've talked about agencies before, but all of this that Gail's talking about seems so big. If you hire through an agency, they do all of that.
And that is why, we hear from people, but an agency is so expensive, it's $30 an hour. Yes. And part of the reason is they might be paying the worker $20 an hour, but as the employer, they're interviewing the people to make sure that they're getting quality people. They're doing all the background checks. They're doing all the tax reporting. They're doing all of that. They're doing the workers' comp. And one of the things that was on the very early slide of what happens if the caregiver is sick. When you're going through an agency, they also usually have a backup plan to send somebody else in if your normal caregiver is sick. So those are the things that extra money that you're paying the agency, that's what it's covering. If you're going the direct route, you're saving that money, but you are taking on the responsibility directly to yourself. And Ben, I'm going to bat the independent contractor over to you.
All right. So, as we mentioned before, with the independent contractor piece, your tax report, you're not on the hook to withhold taxes, but you do have to be sure you are keeping records first and foremost for 1099 reporting purposes at the end of the year. But you're also going to want to keep records just for the sake of protection. if your home health care worker does not report their income to the IRS and the IRS comes after them, you want to be as sure that if the IRS comes knocking at your door through further investigation, you can provide them all the records and everything that you need. The other piece that I want to point out is one that most lawyers are fairly persnickety about. Put everything in writing. When you do hire, and this really goes for a W-2 employee as well, but it's particularly important in the case of an independent contractor. Everything has to be in writing. We don't want handshake deals, because if there's a dispute arise, if there's liability issues crop up, then it becomes he said, she said. And that's, in my mind as a lawyer, that's an unacceptable level of risk for the employer. So what we want to do is we want to be sure we're crafting a good employment agreement between the home health care provider and yourself as the person receiving services. You want to make it clear in there that they are an independent contractor. They are assuming these responsibilities, and they're also waiving a lot of the, they're also assuming a lot of the liability that could result because of the fact that they are an independent contractor and not a W-2 employee.
I kind of wanted to jump in here a little bit too, that you can't hire an independent contractor and not pay them a marketable wage. You can't hire them for $5 an hour. Conversely, you can't pay them $100 an hour. That is not market consistent. That's going to blow back on you eventually. But also, as Jamie said, my job is primarily with public benefits, Medicaid, and sometimes VA. Without an employment contract, Medicaid and VA will both say, well, there's no verification of why you were paying this person. There's no expectations. We're just going to say that you gave that money to that person because out of the goodness of your heart. And that can be devastating for any public benefits. You always got to look ahead. You can't be short-sighted in what you're doing here. And unfortunately, a lot of people that I sit across the table from did not think past just getting somebody to watch mom for today. And you have to think about what you're doing and document everything.
And we're talking about people staying at home. And so you might not be thinking Medicaid yet, but VA can definitely be used as income to help pay for a caregiver at home. And so that reinforces what Kathy's saying about the contract. If you have VA potential, you'll want to make sure that you're doing this the right way so that you can get that reimbursement from the VA to help pay for this caregiver.
Right. The VA pension is based on unreimbursed medical expenses. And unless you can document that this caregiver is a medical expense, you can't use it against, with the VA to get a pension from the VA. So yeah, it's always important that you document everything. And I don't mean by a note on your phone or writing a note. It really should be reviewed by someone like a lawyer to make sure that it's all legal and you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. The internet is very easy to fall into that trap of, well, I got it off the internet, but it was not appropriate for your situation, or it created problems with your situation unintended.
So Ben, what needs to be in that contract?
Well, as I mentioned before, you're going to want to specify whether they're a W-2 employee or an independent contractor. You're going to want to specify the terms of the relationship, whether it's at will or some other employment status. You would want to specify how taxes are going to be treated. The fact that you're saying it's a W-2 employee or an independent contractor, that's all well and good, but you're also going to want to specify in there exactly how often tax reporting is going to take place, when and where and how. You're going to want to, to the extent that you want your home healthcare provider to waive liability for certain things, like premises liability or whatever else. You're going to want to put those in the agreement. You're going to want to, if you have let's say one of the parties lives in a different state, comes up more frequently in this area than in most others, but you're going to want to include a choice of law provision, determine which state's laws govern in the event of a dispute. You'll also want to put in rate of pay, how frequently they're going to get paid, how they're going to get paid. Maybe that's by check or direct deposit or something else. We do recommend ultimately that you pay not with cash. Check, direct deposit, some other way by which you can specifically track. Either there's a paper trail that gets left behind that says, I paid this person this much on such and so a date. You don't necessarily get that with cash, because it moves from one place to another. Ledgers can be to a certain extent unreliable, but if we have checks, when those get submitted to a bank for cashing, the bank keeps a record of the check. And direct deposits, those show up in your bank statements each month. Those will you can create a paper trail with that. It really goes back to that. You want to keep as many contemporaneous records as you possibly can for your protection.
When Ben talked about ledgers could be unreliable, oftentimes we come in and the family say, well, here, I kept a record of how much I paid them. Think about it from the other side. That doesn't mean anything.
Mhm.
I could sit and make a list of how much money I paid Gail for the last year, and say, well, here, see, I have a list, when in fact, Gail got nothing from me. So there needs to be that paper trail, that check or that deposit that is a third party confirmation of what you paid them.
Well, in addition to just the check, it needs to say, well, what was it for?
Yes.
So that's where your record keeping says, in this week, they worked 20 hours. We had 5 days a week, 4 hours a day, and we paid them X amount per hour. And that's coming up to this amount of the check. So there needs to be a calculation of how did we get to the amount that we paid them.
If I might, I would make a couple of observations. As I think you've probably all gathered from listening to this, the law presumes, or the tax law pretty much presumes an employment relationship. So it has to be, if you want to be doing somehow independent contractor, that has to be overcome. And the only ways to really overcome that are to sit down and specify all of the factors and deal with the factors that there are, and put that in writing and decide who's going to do what. Just saying that it's going to be an independent contractor arrangement, and the parties ostensibly agreeing to that, the two parties, that is the person employing the services and the person providing the services, is not going to bind the regulatory authorities. So the IRS may say, well, that's fine if you have a contract that says this, but that doesn't change the fact that the status is different from what was said. And we'll come up to one on workers' comp in a little while, in which I lived through that about 30 years ago. And regulatory authorities there, that being Illinois Workers' Compensation, said what the contract is between the parties is not really the determining factor. So if you want to try to get around the employment aspect, you need to think that through and you need to put it in writing. Number two, somebody said, you know, going to Google is great, but your best bet is to make sure that your accountants and your attorneys are on board. And if you want to mitigate your risk as much as possible, it needs to be passed upon and approved by your advisors, your legal and financial advisors. And even then, of course, it doesn't always. You know, the IRS had a notice that was given a few years ago that said even if your lawyer approves that this is a tax deductible affair, that doesn't mean you can avoid penalties if it ultimately is found not to be. So it's a matter of managing your risk, and in all cases, or almost all cases, I would suggest that you get the appropriate legal and financial counseling that you need, and proceed very mindfully and very cautiously.
Once you have employed the person, we're assuming that they are a W-2, an actual employee and not an independent contractor. You have ongoing tax reporting to do. You have Social Security, Medicare, income tax, and the employer side of taxes. If you've only ever been an employee in your life, you may not realize, you know that money is being taken out of your wages to pay taxes, but you may not realize that your employer is matching that. And so you as the employer will be paying that employer side. You will need to be filing the unemployment, federal and state, and pay that unemployment tax, file and pay the withholding tax, federal and state. And there's issuing the W-2 and filing with Social Security Administration. And the employee will need to report this as income. You're reporting it that you paid it alerts the different tax entities that somebody on the other end should be reporting that as income. Did I miss anything, Ben?
Not that I can, not that I can see. The only thing I would point out is just the importance of keeping records alongside all of this stuff. To whether it's an employee or an independent contractor, you're going to want to make notes, make sure that you or somebody you trust, your agent or whoever else, is keeping track of all of these, showing how they calculate the withholdings, and it's especially keeping receipts for payments on those withholdings. Again, to make sure you're protected, and that if anyone should ever ask about them, you can provide the records to them.
Taxes or questions come up, and sometimes it's 6 months later. Sometimes a tax question comes up a couple of years later, and you have to go back and show what happened at that time to just defend yourself, that indeed you did pay the share that you should be paying. So keep those records, and don't assume that because the person doesn't work for you anymore, you can get rid of those. Hang on to them. And what is the standard? 7 years?
Yes, that is correct. 7 years is generally the recommended. I don't think that's put into the tax code anywhere, but as a general rule, 7 years is the recommended time for which to keep those kinds of financial records. After which time, shred them, burn them, whatever you want to do with them at that point.
So the bottom line, I almost guarantee that you're not going to know how to do the forms and what needs to be done. So the bottom line is talk to your accountant to make sure that you're doing the right forms and you're doing your compliance for state and federal. Home care tax deductions. This is from the other side. This is you as the employer for bringing someone into your home. What can you deduct to help pay for that care? You again will want to keep those records that you're keeping that Ben and Kathy have already mentioned. Those are the records that you're going to need now on the side of your income tax to help offset your income tax because you're paying medical expenses. There's a Schedule H, and that is used for medical expenses, and that's where you would enter this information. And there is also a dependent adult tax credit. And Jamie, can you clarify that one a little more?
Yes, I can. In fact, Kathy and I have used this in a previous life, even before Golder Care was started. We have, on at least one occasion that I can think of, used this as a planning strategy to try to preserve assets. And that was one where we transferred assets to the kids, and then mom went into long-term care, and her income, her Social Security was less than half of the cost of her care. So she paid whatever her income was, and the kids were paying the rest out of monies, and hopefully it would stay that way, but out of monies that she had given them. And as a result, they were paying more than half of her support. And at least as the rules stood at that time, that meant that she was a dependent. They could claim her as a dependent, and they could take her medical expenses as deductions to the extent that they itemized. And once those medical expenses had reached, I think at that time it was $7,500 a year. Sometimes it's $10,000 a year. But obviously, long-term care costs significantly more than that. So they got to take mom as a dependent adult. They got to deduct the medical expenses that they were paying from monies that were now theirs. And the difficulty that we had in that case was that there were two kids. And so because of the $7,500, I think it was at the time, the initial amount that you had to overcome. In other words, the medical expenses had to be greater than $7,500. And to the extent that they were, only to the extent that they were, could they be deducted. So we also utilized a form that was available that said one of the kids assigned their share of that tax deduction to the other one. So that meant we only had the one $7,500 deductible to meet. And we used the one, I believe, who had a higher income tax, higher marginal income tax bracket, because we got more bang for the buck. We got the deduction meant less taxes. And then what happened was that individual, to the extent that they saved taxes, they paid half of that to their sibling, okay? And so they shared the savings that way. That was an informal agreement. So that sometimes will come in. I will also point out that we tell people with Golder Care that our services are tax deductible because they are patient advocacy services. So you want to, some of these are not directly medical expenses, they are healthcare support expenses, much in the line of like a seeing eye dog would be. They may be that. So you're going to want to work with your accountant to find out what portions of what you're paying to people are deductible as a healthcare or a medical expense. And that's another reason why it's so important to specify the various duties that are being done, because some of them may be deductible and some of them may not be. And so the deduction may be prorated as a result of the differences in the contracted activities.
Which takes us to insurance. We've talked about workers' comp, and Jamie's going to give us a story on that in a moment. But when talking to local, I talked to a couple of local property casualty insurers, and that would be the policy that you would be using, your homeowner's policy, and what was covered by your homeowner's policy and what was not. And the transportation part was under your car policy. So let's start with the easy part. I have hired a caregiver, and one of the duties of the caregiver is to drive dad to his doctor's appointments, take him to the doctor's appointments, and bring him back home. So the question is, whose car is the caregiver driving? If the caregiver is driving their own car and there's an accident, it goes to their insurance. If we're using my car and there's an accident, then it's going to go to my insurance. But I need to notify my auto insurance company that I have given permission to this person to drive my car when they're taking dad to doctor's appointments. So they're aware that somebody else is driving my car. With my homeowner's policy, if I have somebody that's coming in on a regular basis to provide care, that it depends on what happens. If I have been vacuuming and I leave the vacuum out and they trip over the cord, it's my fault. And it definitely goes under my homeowner's policy. If part of their duties are to vacuum and they trip on the vacuum, that would be a workers' comp thing because it's an accident that matches up to their job duties. It's not just, a clumsiness and it's my fault because I left something out that tripped them. So you're going to need to have a workers' comp policy if they are your employee. If they are an independent contractor, you're going to want to make sure that they are licensed, bonded, whatever, that they have some kind of coverage, that they're covered and not coming after you. And Jamie, you've got an excellent real life story on this.
Yeah, and it's from about 35 years ago. But it just shows you that this is not a new issue or something that we're now concerned about. We had one where a lady came in and helped the husband and the family take care of mother, which included some lifting at times. And she did housework, etc. The accountant set it up as an independent contractor. And it was thought that this lady was an independent contractor. And we didn't have problems with the IRS. Nobody questioned it from there. That doesn't mean that it wasn't questionable, but the IRS never questioned it. And sometimes it's not just a matter of knowing the rules, it's a matter of knowing what you can kind of finesse or get by with. In this case, as I say, the lady went and helped her son move one weekend. And in so doing, she wrenched her back. She came back and she continued to work with the family, helping them take care of mom. But at this point, whatever lifting she was doing for mom actually had a tendency to exacerbate or make worse her conditions that she had gotten when she was just helping her son do some things. And that is one of the bases under workers' comp for compensation, is that the work somehow, not necessarily through anybody's fault or negligence, cause an exacerbation of a precondition or a previous injury. So in this case, the lady had an exacerbating circumstance, and eventually a workers' comp claim was filed against mom and dad, and they dumped probably $30,000 in a legal defense trying to stave that off. And eventually the authorities said, again, it doesn't necessarily matter what the contract says in terms of its conclusion as to whether this person is an independent contractor or not. It's really what actually happens. Okay. And in this case, there was no written contract. It's what actually happens. And they said in this case, she is an employee. She's entitled to workers' compensation. And mom and dad just never purchased a workers' compensation insurance policy. So mom and dad were responsible for paying for the defense on their own, out of their own pocket. And they were responsible for paying for any judgment or settlement. And in this case, they spent about 30,000, as I said, this is 30 years ago, in legal fees defending it, and another $30,000 in ultimately settling it. So if you got any questions, it's better, I would suggest, to insure. And as I said, you need to go over this with your lawyer, not just legal Zoom or sessions like this or books. This is something that needs to be looked at, and if it truly is an independent contract situation, the activities need to be specified so it can be proved that that's what it is, and it's not an employment situation.
And an important thing would be to talk also with your insurance agent, because an all-state policy is not the same as a State Farm policy. You know, they're all different. So you want to understand clearly what is and is not covered in your homeowner's policy for having someone working in your home. And if you need to have an additional rider or specialized insurance to cover it, having that person working in your home. So talk with your experts and make sure that you're doing it right. And Jamie, you have this kind of summary of our thoughts.
Yeah, I'm back. Well, we're back to this. This is kind of what I call a framing slide. We mentioned this slide earlier before we went into what I would call more of the meat of the thing. And these are just some of the things that we've come up with. I see we're about 50 minutes into this presentation, or at least into the hour. And we like to keep it to an hour. So we, as I indicated earlier, we haven't touched upon all of these, and we certainly have not touched upon these things in a very thorough and comprehensive manner. Our discussion today is really designed to provide you some insight. And I think we've done that, and I think it's been very interesting as to some of these issues and how they can interplay with one another. You know, if you hire an agency and they've got an employee who ends up abusing mom or somebody else, they become mandated reporters. Well, if you're the employer, are you a mandated reporter? There's just a whole slew of questions and issues that come about in this area and that need to be considered in terms of compliance. And as I said, there is just no substitute for employing the services of a lawyer and an accountant, because at least at that point, if the authorities disagree with the conclusions that were made, at least you can say, well, you know, I did it on authoritative advice. And so sometimes then if there was like a tax penalty or something like that, you may not have that because it was done on authoritative advice. And even though the authorities ultimately said, well, we disagree, we think that the situation is otherwise. We have arrived at question times. Question time.
You can type questions into the chat box on Zoom, and they will appear to me and we can read them. And
I guess
Kathy,
I have one question that I would ask, and I mentioned it earlier. You know, Hillary Strayer is on here. She's a lawyer too. Is there anything on here that particularly tripped your trigger, Hillary, that you wanted to emphasize, or that, or maybe we didn't touch that you thought should be, or anything like that? Any particular insight you might want to add?
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, all of you. I just, would love to see some of those contracts that you draft. I have tried to draft them, and my goodness, they got awfully long. So there's so much to include. So I mean, I think that I'm right with you that this just points up to the benefit of working with an attorney on this, even though they're somewhat standardized issues. The individual family applications are quite different in my experience.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Anything else? We have about 5 minutes if anybody is inclined.
Kathy, did you have any that we often receive on questions?
I just want to stress that oftentimes people fall into this neighbor's sis daughter is a CNA, and you know, they'll come and take care of dad for 4 hours a day, and it's cheaper than an agency. And I don't want to mess with an agency to just have them, you know, they think of it more as Gail's example of the babysitter just coming over for a few hours, you know, and then it gets to be more and more and more and every day. And finally, and now we're a year into this, and nobody stopped to think about the IRS ramifications. Nobody stopped to think about the insurance ramifications. And now dad's ready to go into a facility because, you know, for example, he's had this massive stroke, and caring for him at home is no longer an option. Now we got to look at Medicaid, and, you know, we're playing catch up, trying to establish what all that money he gave to the neighbor's sister's daughter was for. You know, people fall into that trap so easy. And one of our goals is to try to open people's eyes and understand what they're getting into so they can go into it empowered, as part of the club's name, to handle these issues.
Yeah.
So in some cases, I would suggest that it probably is cheaper, and I don't know that that's a good word. It may be less expensive to actually employ the agency to bring in help and allow them to and offload all of those duties and potential liabilities, or most of them, onto the agency. There's a reason they charge, you know, what they charge. The other piece that I would say is this, is that if you're doing an independent contract, and the person who's the independent contractor is to pay their own withholding, et cetera, you're going to want to make sure that that person is likely to do that and actually does do that. Because if they don't, and if they're just doing shortcuts, and they don't do that, and then the IRS doesn't get paid, I think it's more likely then that the IRS may say, you were really an employer and it was your duty to withhold and you didn't do it, so you owe it. You know, if you've done your due diligence in that situation, if you've done your due diligence with your lawyer and your accountant, you may be able to avoid at least penalties. You may still owe certain taxes, but you're going to want to make this stuff as airtight and generally speaking, risk avoidant as you can. That said, as I mentioned, that's what any good lawyer or advisor is going to try to do, and that they need to know the rules, but they also need to know. Sometimes we want to say what you can finesse or what you can get by with, and so they need to know the practicalities too. And that's something you're not going to find directly on Google or from a number of these prepackaged services.
Well, looking at what we have for upcoming topics, we are going to be discussing, are they family members or caregivers? How to avoid the burning out family caregivers? And how can the parish nurse program help with aging in place? Decluttering for fall prevention, home safety, and accessibility. And there are some other topics listed there. for our upcoming topics, things for you to look forward to. We are generally on the third Wednesday of the month. December will have a change due to the holiday. We want to avoid that Christmas week. And am I correct, Kathy? We're the second Wednesday that month? Reading her lips, I believe she said, yes, that's correct. So those are the upcoming topics that we have. If you think of additional questions, or if you're viewing this online later and you have questions, you can always send them to our email, elc@goldercare.com, and then we can get back to you with answers or a callback, whatever is appropriate. So we
Thank you, everybody, for joining us
today.
today. I think we covered some good ground, and as we indicated, there is a lot more to talk about and cover. But compliance is oftentimes very tricky, and it offers some huge caregiver traps that we try to make sure that our people avoid. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Excellent program. If you ever run out of topics, you could probably do a sequel or two on this topic.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Hillary. And to all of you, thank you. And until next time, enjoy and have a successful and empowered aging between now and then.